In the heart of a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills, life moved slowly. The town was the kind where everyone knew everyone, where the same faces greeted you each morning at the grocery store or waved at you from their porches as you passed by. It wasn't a place where dramatic events usually took place, and most people liked it that way. The people here were content with their daily routines and small-town simplicity. It was a close-knit community, but it had its unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. At the edge of the town, near an old park with rusting swings and benches that had seen better days, lived Maya, a bright and curious 9-year-old black girl. Maya lived with her mother in a modest, 2-bedroom house. Her father had passed away when she was very young, and her mother had been working 2 jobs to provide for them ever since. Despite the hardships, Maya's mother had raised her to be thoughtful and compassionate, traits that shone through in every little thing Maya did. Every morning, Maya walked the short distance to her elementary school. She loved school, especially her art classes, and she always carried a brightly colored backpack filled with sketches and drawings. After school, while most kids rushed home to watch TV or play video games, Maya preferred a different routine. Instead of going straight home, she liked to visit the local park. It wasn't the most popular place for kids her age. Most people saw it as a rundown spot, not worth their time. But Maya found it peaceful. The rustling of the trees, the soft chirping of birds, and the distant hum of the town's traffic were a comforting soundtrack to her afternoons. Maya would often sit on one of the swings, her feet barely brushing the ground as she hummed a tune to herself. She'd bring along a snack, usually a sandwich her mother had packed in her lunch that she hadn't finished at school. As she ate, she would watch people pass by, noticing things most others didn't. That's how she first noticed Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens was a homeless man, easily recognizable by his worn-out coat, faded baseball cap, and the small collection of belongings he kept in a tattered shopping cart. He was white, probably in his late 50s, with a face lined by the hardships of life. Every day, like clockwork, he sat on the same park bench, staring off into the distance as if lost in his own world. He was a permanent fixture at the park, but most people ignored him. The adults avoided eye contact, some parents warned their children to steer clear of him, and even the teenagers, who hung out in the park after school, kept their distance. But Maya didn't see him the way others did. She noticed that he always smiled at her, a soft, almost sad smile, whenever their eyes met. There was something about his quiet presence that intrigued her. He wasn't like the other adults she knew. He didn't rush around, didn't talk loudly, didn't seem to expect anything from anyone. He was just there. One day, as Maya was about to head home, she noticed she still had half a sandwich in her backpack. Without thinking much about it, she walked over to Mr. Stevens. She could feel her heart beating a little faster, not from fear, but from the unknown. As she approached him, she hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But Mr. Stevens looked up at her, his eyes kind and his smile gentle, and that gave her the courage she needed. "Hi," she said shyly, holding out the sandwich. "I didn't finish this at lunch. Would you like it?" Mr. Stevens blinked in surprise. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to refuse. But then, he nodded slowly, accepting the sandwich with both hands as if it were something precious. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice hoarse but warm. Maya smiled, feeling a strange but pleasant warmth inside her chest. She turned and walked away, not expecting anything in return. It was such a small act, a half-eaten sandwich. But to Mr. Stevens, it seemed to mean more than words could express. As Maya left the park that day, she didn't think much about what had just happened. It felt natural to her, the way you might help a friend who had forgotten their lunch. But for Mr. Stevens, that small gesture had broken through the invisible barrier that seemed to separate him from everyone else in the town. The next day, Maya returned to the park after school, just as she always did. This time, she made sure to save more of her sandwich. She saw Mr. Stevens sitting on the same bench, just as before. She walked over to him again, sandwich in hand, and offered it to him without hesitation. "Hi again," she said cheerfully. "I brought you another one." Mr. Stevens smiled again, this time a little wider. He looked at the sandwich, then at Maya, as if trying to understand why she was doing this. "You're a kind girl," he said, his voice a little steadier than the day before. "What's your name?" "Maya," she answered, sitting on the edge of the bench for a moment. "What's yours?" "Stevens. Just call me Stevens." And so a simple routine was born. Every day after school, Maya would bring Mr. Stevens a sandwich or some fruit, and they would exchange a few words. Sometimes he would tell her stories about when he was younger, before he ended up on the streets. Other times, they would just sit in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. Maya never asked him about his life. She didn't need to. She was just happy to be a friend to someone who seemed to need one. For weeks, this small act of kindness continued unnoticed by the rest of the town. Mr. Stevens was still largely invisible to everyone else, and Maya's daily visits were just part of her quiet, unassuming life. But unbeknownst to them, this simple bond of trust and kindness was setting in motion something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. It was a perfectly normal day in the neighborhood, just like any other. The sun was shining, the streets were quiet, and Maya had just left school, her backpack bouncing against her small frame as she skipped toward the park. She had saved half of her peanut butter sandwich for Mr. Stevens, just like she always did. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But that day, something would happen that would turn their lives upside down, something that would bring the police to Maya's door and shake the entire town to its core. What started as a simple, compassionate gesture was about to change everything. And it all began with a sandwich. Over the next few weeks, Maya and Mr. Stevens fell into a comfortable routine. Every afternoon after school, Maya would make her way to the park, her small feet crunching on the gravel path as she made her way to the same bench where Mr. Stevens sat each day. He was always there, waiting quietly with his worn-out coat wrapped around him, even in the warmest of days. Though he rarely spoke about himself at first, Maya would happily chatter away, telling him about her school day, her favorite books, and the little things that caught her attention. As time passed, though, Mr. Stevens began to open up in ways Maya didn't fully grasp at first. During one of their daily meetings, as she handed him a sandwich, he surprised her by launching into a story about his past. "Did you know," he said, looking down at the sandwich with a wistful smile, "I used to wear a suit every day. Yeah, crazy, right? Not a fancy suit, mind you, but I wore one. I worked in an office for almost 20 years. Maya's eyes grew wide with curiosity. "Really? What kind of office?" "I was in finance," he said, chewing thoughtfully. "You wouldn't believe it now, but I used to sit in front of computers and spreadsheets all day. I wasn't some big shot, though, just enough to keep the bills paid. Had a small house, a wife, and a daughter. Once." "What happened?" Maya asked innocently, her big brown eyes locked on him, full of the unguarded curiosity only a child can have. Mr. Stevens sighed, staring into the distance as if lost in the memories of a life long gone. "The economy happened. You're too young to know about things like recessions and financial collapses. But, well, when the economy tanked, I lost everything. My job went first, then my savings. My wife. She left soon after that. Took our daughter with her. Didn't blame her. I had nothing left to offer." He paused, his voice tightening. "I moved around, tried finding work here and there, but nothing stuck. I ended up here because it was quiet. No one bothers me much, except you, of course," he added with a faint smile, trying to lighten the moment. Maya didn't quite understand the gravity of his words, but she could sense the sadness behind them. She didn't know much about jobs or finances, but she knew enough to recognize that Mr. Stevens had lost something important, something that had left him feeling invisible to the world. She had a strange way of processing the story, too innocent to grasp the full weight of it. To her, Mr. Stevens was still just the nice man who smiled at her and accepted her sandwiches. He wasn't some tragic figure to pity. He was her friend. But outside their little world of park bench conversations and shared sandwiches, the rest of the town had its own perceptions of Mr. Stevens. People barely noticed him, but those who did often assumed the worst. He was the quiet shadow in the background, someone to be ignored or avoided. He didn't fit the mold of what this town considered safe or respectable. One afternoon, as Maya sat with Mr. Stevens, talking about the book she was reading at school, an elderly woman walking her dog stopped nearby, her eyes narrowing as she watched the unlikely pair. Her name was Mrs. Jenkins, and she had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember. Known for being overly suspicious and quick to spread gossip, she was always on the lookout for anything that didn't seem right. Mrs. Jenkins lingered, her gaze flicking between Maya and Mr. Stevens, her lips pursed in disapproval. As she walked away, her mind churned with thoughts of danger, convinced that Maya was getting too close to someone she shouldn't be around. She didn't know anything about Mr. Stevens' past or Maya's kindness. All she saw was a vulnerable little girl and a homeless man, a combination that didn't sit well with her at all. By the next day, whispers had already started circulating in the town. Mrs. Jenkins, being who she was, had already spoken to several neighbors, warning them about the dangerous man she'd seen talking to Maya. "He's probably a criminal," she'd say in hushed tones, shaking her head with concern. "Who knows what kind of trouble he's in? Someone ought to do something before that poor girl gets hurt." It didn't take long for these rumors to reach Maya's mother. One evening, as Maya was helping her with dinner, her mother sat her down at the table, her face full of worry. "Maya, I need to ask you something," her mother began, her voice soft but serious. "I've heard from some people in town that you've been spending time with a man at the park. Is that true?" Maya blinked, a little confused by the sudden shift in her mother's tone. "You mean Mr. Stevens?" "Yes," her mother said, frowning slightly. "I've heard some things about him. Some people are saying he might not be safe. I know you mean well, honey, but you shouldn't be talking to strangers like that." "But he's not a stranger, Mama," Maya protested. "He's my friend. I've been giving him my sandwiches because he doesn't have any food." Her mother's expression softened for a moment. She couldn't help but be proud of her daughter's compassion. But the worry quickly returned. "I understand you want to help, Maya, but sometimes it's hard to know who you can trust. I'm just trying to keep you safe." Maya didn't argue further, but inside she didn't feel scared of Mr. Stevens. He had never given her any reason to feel unsafe. To her, he was just lonely, like the stray cats she sometimes fed behind the house. Still, her mother's words lingered in the back of her mind. The next day, Maya went to the park as usual, her mother's warning still fresh in her thoughts. As she approached the bench where Mr. Stevens usually sat, she found herself hesitating for the first time. What if her mother was right? What if there was something she didn't know about him? But then she saw him sitting there, just as he always did, and all her doubts melted away. Mr. Stevens looked up as she approached, his familiar, tired smile greeting her. "Afternoon, Maya," he said quietly. "Hi, Mr. Stevens," she replied, sitting down beside him and pulling out a sandwich from her bag. She handed it to him, just like every other day. They sat in silence for a while, and Maya wondered if she should tell him about the rumors going around the town. She didn't want to hurt his feelings, but she also didn't want to keep secrets from her mother. Before she could decide, Mr. Stevens spoke, as if sensing her unease. "You know, Maya," he said, taking a small bite of the sandwich, "people don't always understand why someone ends up where I am. They see a man on a bench and think he's done something wrong, that he's dangerous or broken. But sometimes life just doesn't go the way you plan." Maya looked at him, her small face serious. "But you're not dangerous, right?" Mr. Stevens chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, kiddo. I'm just trying to get by. Same as everyone else." She smiled, reassured. Whatever the town thought, She knew Mr. Stevens wasn't a bad person. She would keep bringing him sandwiches, no matter what anyone said. But unbeknownst to Maya, something was happening that neither she nor Mr. Stevens could have predicted. The rumors had reached the ears of someone important, someone who would take them far more seriously than just idle gossip. As Maya left the park that day, skipping home with her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, she had no idea that the very next day, something significant would happen. Something that would bring the police to her door and change everything she thought she knew about kindness and trust. It was just a regular day like any other. But tomorrow, everything would be different. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, the kind of day that usually filled Maya with excitement. She had raced through her schoolwork, her mind already on her daily visit to the park. As she skipped along the familiar path, her brightly colored backpack swinging behind her, she clutched a sandwich in one hand, ready to share it with Mr. Stevens as always. But today, something felt different. When she rounded the corner into the park, she saw Mr. Stevens sitting on his usual bench. His posture was more slouched than usual, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. Maya noticed the way he clenched and unclenched his hands, an anxious rhythm she hadn't seen in him before. It was as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. "Hi, Mr. Stevens," Maya called out as she approached, her voice cheerful despite the knot of unease forming in her stomach. Mr. Stevens looked up, but instead of the usual smile, his expression was tense, almost grim. "Hey, Maya," he said softly, his voice sounding strained. She sat down next to him and pulled the sandwich from her bag, offering it like she always did. But to her surprise, Mr. Stevens didn't reach for it. He stared at the sandwich for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Not today, Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya's brow furrowed. This was the first time he had ever refused her offer. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the park again, his eyes flicking nervously towards the street. Maya followed his gaze but didn't see anything unusual. The park was mostly empty, just a few distant figures walking their dogs. But something in Mr. Stevens' demeanor made her feel uneasy. She had never seen him like this before. Before she could ask more questions, the sound of sirens pierced the peaceful afternoon. The wailing echoed through the park, growing louder with each passing second. Maya turned her head and saw, in the distance, flashing blue and red lights. Several police cars were speeding down the street, heading straight toward the park. Her heart skipped a beat, not out of fear for herself, but because she saw Mr. Stevens' face change entirely. His calm, quiet demeanor was gone, replaced by fear, a kind of fear that made her small body tense up in response. "Mr. Stevens?" Maya asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stood up abruptly, shoving his hands into the pockets of his worn coat. "Maya, you should go home," he muttered, not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the approaching police cars, now pulling up near the park entrance. Maya didn't move. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the tension in the air, thick like a storm about to break. The police officers stepped out of their vehicles, their radios crackling as they coordinated their movements. They walked with purpose, their faces set in hard, focused expressions. Two officers headed straight for Mr. Stevens, while another group spread out, searching the area as if looking for something or someone. Maya watched, frozen in place as the officers approached her friend. She expected them to ask him simple questions, but instead, the situation escalated rapidly. "Stevens," one of the officers barked. "Stand up and keep your hands where we can see them." Mr. Stevens raised his hands slowly, but his face was etched with dread. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice low and shaky. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officers didn't seem to care. Without warning, they began rifling through the few belongings Mr. Stevens had with him: a tattered bag, an old jacket, and a small stack of books. Maya watched in shock as they dumped his belongings onto the ground, shaking out every item, as if searching for something incriminating. "Hey," Maya cried, standing up and stepping forward. "Stop. He didn't do anything." One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, turned his attention to her. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice sharp. Maya swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how small she was compared to the looming presence of the police. "I'm his friend," she stammered. "He's not a bad person." The officer narrowed his eyes at her, his gaze skeptical. "Why are you here? Do your parents know you're talking to this man?" Maya opened her mouth to answer, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She had come to the park, like she always did, to share a sandwich with her friend. But now it felt like everything was unraveling around her. The officer glanced at Mr. Stevens, then back at Maya. "You need to come with us. We're going to take you home." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, but she nodded, too scared and confused to argue. The officer gently took her by the arm and led her away from the park. As they walked, she glanced back at Mr. Stevens, who was still standing there with his hands in the air, surrounded by officers as they questioned him. The last thing she saw before they turned the corner was the look of sadness and resignation on his face. The ride home in the police car was silent, save for the crackling of the radio and the occasional murmur between the officers. Maya's heart raced. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Mr. Stevens had never done anything wrong. He was just her friend, the man who told her stories and accepted her sandwiches with gratitude. When they arrived at her house, Maya's mother was already standing on the porch, her face pale with worry. As soon as she saw the police car, her hand flew to her mouth in shock. The officer escorted Maya to the door and knocked firmly. When her mother opened it, the officer explained the situation in a few clipped sentences. "Ma'am, we found your daughter at the park with a man who's just been taken into custody. He's wanted for questioning regarding a crime in a neighboring town. Your daughter may have witnessed something important, so we need to speak with her." Maya's mother's face went from worried to frantic. What? What do you mean? What crime? She's just a little girl." The officer glanced at Maya, then back at her mother. "The man your daughter was with, Mr. Stevens, is a suspect in a burglary that happened 2 towns over. We're still piecing things together, but we need to be sure your daughter isn't involved in anything dangerous." Maya's head was spinning. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mr. Stevens, a criminal. It didn't make sense. He was kind. He was gentle. He couldn't have done something like that. Her mother pulled her into the house, her voice shaking as she thanked the officers. Once the door was shut, she knelt in front of Maya, gripping her shoulders tightly. "Maya, what were you doing with that man?" she asked, her voice full of fear. Maya, tears streaming down her face, shook her head. "He's not a bad person, Mama. I was just giving him food. He's my friend." Her mother's eyes filled with worry, but she pulled Maya close, hugging her tightly. "We'll figure this out, baby," she whispered, though her own fear was clear in her voice. That night, Maya lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Stevens standing there, surrounded by police, looking more alone than ever. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Her small act of kindness had set off a chain of events she never could have imagined. And it wasn't over yet. The next morning, the quiet town was anything but quiet. The news of Mr. Stevens' arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting gossip and speculation in every corner. From the local coffee shop to the grocery store, it was all anyone could talk about. The story of how little Maya had been seen with the homeless man at the park added an extra layer of intrigue that no one could resist discussing. Some were quick to condemn Maya's mother, while others expressed sympathy for Mr. Stevens, who had always been a quiet and unassuming presence in the community. At first, Maya was unaware of the growing storm. She spent the morning in her room, curled up on her bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. She kept replaying the moment when the police had taken Mr. Stevens away. The look of fear on his face, the sound of sirens blaring in the background. She didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. She had only wanted to help him. Was that so bad? Downstairs, her mother paced the living room, her phone buzzing nonstop with calls and messages. Some were from concerned neighbors, asking what had happened, while others were more accusatory, wondering how she could have let her daughter befriend a dangerous stranger. Each call seemed to chip away at her already frayed nerves. I told her to stay away, Maya's mother muttered to herself as she hung up yet another call, her face pale with stress. I should have been more careful. It wasn't long before the police came back to their house, this time not to take Maya home, but to question her about her interactions with Mr. Stevens. A detective, a tall woman with sharp eyes, sat down at the kitchen table with Maya and her mother. The detective's notepad was ready, her pen poised to take notes, but her tone was gentle as she spoke to Maya. "Hi, Maya," the detective said, offering a small smile. "I know this is confusing and probably a little scary for you, but I just need to ask you a few questions about Mr. Stevens. Is that okay?" Maya nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at her mother, who was standing nearby, arms crossed, clearly anxious but trying to remain calm for her daughter's sake. "Can you tell me how you know Mr. Stevens?" the detective asked. Maya took a deep breath and began to explain how she had first noticed Mr. Stevens sitting on the park bench, how she'd started sharing her sandwiches with him, and how he had always been kind to her. As she spoke, she could see the detective scribbling notes, her face thoughtful but unreadable. "Did Mr. Stevens ever talk to you about where he was from, or what he did before he came to this town?" the detective asked, her voice steady. Maya hesitated, her mind flashing back to the stories Mr. Stevens had told her. He had talked about his job in finance, about losing his family and his home. But there were other things too, little things that hadn't seemed important at the time. She remembered how sometimes he would go quiet, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to come for him. How he would change the subject quickly if she asked too many questions about his past. "There was one time," Maya said slowly, "when he told me he had to leave a lot of places. He said something about people not understanding him, and that he didn't want any more trouble." The detective's pen paused on the paper. "Did he ever say what kind of trouble?" Maya shook her head. "No, he just said that people thought bad things about him, but that he didn't do anything wrong." The detective nodded, her face thoughtful. "Okay, Maya. That's all I needed to know. Thank you for being so brave and talking to me." Maya's mother exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relieved that the questioning was over. But as the detective left, her words echoed in the quiet house, leaving an uneasy tension hanging in the air. The days that followed were a blur for both Maya and her mother. The town's judgment was swift and harsh. Some people avoided Maya's family entirely, while others whispered behind their backs as they walked down the street. At the grocery store, Maya's mother overheard two women talking about her in hushed tones. "It's irresponsible, letting your kid hang around with someone like that," one woman said, shaking her head. "I know," the other agreed. "He could have hurt her, or worse. You can't be too careful these days." Maya's mother's face flushed with anger and shame, but she bit her tongue. She grabbed her groceries and hurried out of the store, pulling Maya along behind her. Back home, the isolation grew. Calls from friends stopped coming, and even at school, Maya noticed her classmates whispering about her, casting sideways glances whenever she passed by. Some of the kids avoided her altogether, while others were bold enough to ask her why she was friends with this scary man from the park. Maya didn't know how to answer them. She didn't understand why the town had turned on her and her family, or why they were so quick to believe the worst about Mr. Stevens. All she knew was that she felt terrible, like everything was her fault. If only she hadn't given him that sandwich, if only she had listened to her mother. The guilt weighed on her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and relentless. One evening, as Maya and her mother sat down for a quiet dinner, the phone rang. Her mother hesitated before answering, bracing herself for more bad news. But as she listened, her eyes widened in surprise. "What? Are you sure?" she asked, her voice rising with disbelief. Maya watched as her mother listened to the person on the other end, nodding slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and confusion. After she hung up, she turned to Maya, her face still shocked. "They dropped the charges against Mr. Stevens," her mother said, her voice trembling. "He's been cleared of all suspicion. The police were wrong." Maya blinked, her heart lifting for the first time in days. "He didn't do it?" she asked, hope blooming inside her. "No," her mother said, shaking her head. "They found the real suspect in the next town over. It wasn't him." For a moment, relief washed over them both. But then, Maya's mother's brow furrowed in confusion. But if he didn't do anything, why were the police after him in the first place? That question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. It didn't make sense. Why had the police been so convinced that Mr. Stevens was involved in a crime? And why had they targeted him so aggressively, right there in the park? Maya's thoughts raced. She remembered how nervous Mr. Stevens had been that last day, how he had told her to go home before the police arrived. There was something else going on, something that had nothing to do with the burglary they had accused him of. But what? The community, meanwhile, was left divided. Some felt ashamed for having jumped to conclusions about Mr. Stevens, while others stubbornly held on to their suspicions, refusing to believe that the police could have made such a mistake. For Maya and her mother, the relief of his exoneration was bittersweet. The damage had already been done. People's opinions of them hadn't changed overnight, and the whispers still followed them wherever they went. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Mr. Stevens was innocent, but there was something he hadn't told her, something that still hung over them like a dark cloud. And as the days passed, Maya realized that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of uncovering the truth about her quiet friend from the park, a truth that would change everything she thought she knew. The relief that had briefly washed over Maya and her mother when Mr. Stevens was cleared of the charges quickly gave way to confusion. Though the police had exonerated him in the burglary case, the question of why they had been so determined to arrest him in the first place still loomed large. As the days went by, more details began to surface, and the truth that emerged was far more shocking than anyone in the town could have imagined. It started with a small news report that caught the attention of a few curious neighbors. The local paper, in its usual understated way, had published a story about the investigation into Mr. Stevens. It wasn't on the front page, but buried deep inside, where only the most diligent readers might stumble upon it. The article mentioned that while Mr. Stevens had been cleared of the crime, the police had uncovered something about his identity that explained their initial interest in him. Rumors began circulating once again. This time, they were not about Mr. Stevens being a criminal, but about his mysterious past. People whispered in hushed tones at the grocery store, speculating about who he really was. Some even suggested that he had been hiding from the authorities for years. Maya's mother heard fragments of these conversations and felt the weight of the town's curiosity growing once again. Maya, meanwhile, still hadn't seen Mr. Stevens since the day of the arrest. She missed her quiet afternoons at the park, missed the stories he would tell, but more than that, she missed the way he had made her feel like she was making a difference in someone's life. Despite everything, she wanted to see him again. She wanted answers. It wasn't until a few days later that those answers came, though not in the way Maya or anyone else had expected. One evening, while Maya was doing her homework at the kitchen table, her mother sat nearby scrolling through her phone. Suddenly, she gasped, her eyes wide as she stared at the screen. Maya looked up, confused by the shock on her mother's face. "Maya," her mother said slowly, "you need to see this." She handed her phone to Maya, who took it hesitantly. On the screen was a news article from a major financial website, the kind of article that Maya would have normally ignored, but the headline grabbed her attention instantly. Former Wall Street executive found living homeless in small town after years in hiding. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She scrolled down the article, her eyes scanning the text as fast as she could. It was about Mr. Stevens. According to the article, Mr. Stevens had once been a high-profile executive on Wall Street, a man who had made millions managing investments for some of the wealthiest people in the country. But during the financial crash several years ago, he had lost everything. His firm had gone under, taking with it not only his fortune, but also the fortunes of countless investors who had trusted him. The collapse had been devastating, and many of those who lost their money had blamed Mr. Stevens personally. The article went on to explain that after the collapse, Mr. Stevens had disappeared. Some people believed he had fled the country, while others thought he had gone into hiding to avoid the backlash from the people who had lost everything. But no one had seen or heard from him in years, until now. Maya's hands trembled as she continued to read. The article described how the police had been tipped off to Mr. Stevens' presence in the town after a few local residents reported seeing him regularly at the park. At first, the police had suspected he was involved in the burglary, but once they realized who he really was, their focus had shifted. They had been investigating him because of his past, not because of any crime he had committed in the present. Maya's mind spun. Mr. Stevens, the quiet, humble man who had accepted her sandwiches with gratitude, had once been a powerful business executive. It didn't seem possible. She couldn't reconcile the image of the man she had known with the man described in the article. Her mother sat down beside her, looking equally stunned. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "All this time, and no one knew who he really was." The news spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew that the homeless man they had either ignored or feared was once a wealthy and successful businessman. The town's reaction was divided. Some people expressed regret for how they had judged him, while others still clung to their suspicions, convinced that a man like Mr. Stevens must have been hiding something. A few of the town's older residents, who had lived through the financial crash, remembered the headlines and the scandals. They wondered how a man who had once been so powerful could have fallen so far. For Maya, the revelation left her with mixed emotions. She didn't know how to feel about the man she had come to care for. On one hand, she felt proud that she had helped him when no one else would. But on the other hand, she was confused by the idea that someone like Mr. Stevens, someone who had once had so much, could have ended up alone on a park bench, invisible to the world. A few days later, Maya was sitting on the porch when she saw a familiar figure walking slowly down the street. It was Mr. Stevens. He looked the same as ever, his coat worn and his face tired, but there was a different kind of sadness in his eyes now, a sadness that came from knowing his secret was out. Maya stood up and ran to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Stevens," she called out. He stopped and turned to her, a small, weary smile crossing his face. "Hi, Maya," he said quietly. For a moment, they just stood there, unsure of what to say. Finally, Maya spoke. "I saw the news," she said softly. "I know who you are now." Mr. Stevens sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I figured you would," he replied. "It was only a matter of time before people found out." Maya hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Because I didn't want you to see me the way everyone else does," he said. "I didn't want you to think of me as some failed businessman or a man who lost everything. I just wanted to be me, the man who sat on the bench and shared stories with you." Maya nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "But you're still the same person to me," she said, her voice trembling. "You're still my friend." Mr. Stevens smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a long time. "Thank you, Maya. You have no idea how much that means to me. You've been kinder to me than anyone else in this town, and I'll never forget that." They stood in silence for a few moments before Mr. Stevens cleared his throat. "I need to leave town," he said quietly. "It's time for me to move on. I've stayed here long enough." Maya's heart sank. "You're leaving?" He nodded. I've caused enough trouble here. And now that people know who I am, it's harder for me to stay." Maya didn't want him to go, but she knew he had to. "Where will you go?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," Mr. Stevens replied. "But I'll figure it out. I always do." Before he left, Mr. Stevens reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Maya with a soft smile. "This is for you," he said. "You've helped me more than you know, and I wanted to give you something in return." Maya took the envelope, confused but grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. With one last smile, Mr. Stevens turned and walked away, disappearing down the street and out of sight. When Maya opened the envelope later that evening, she found a handwritten note and a small check. The note explained that Mr. Stevens had set aside some of his remaining money for her, enough to help with her future education. It wasn't much, but it was his way of saying thank you for the kindness she had shown him when no one else had. As Maya held the note in her hands, tears filled her eyes. She realized that her small act of kindness had changed both of their lives in ways she never could have imagined. Mr. Stevens had once been a powerful man, but it was her friendship that had given him something he had lost long ago: hope. And though he had left, the impact of their friendship would stay with her forever. The envelope held more than just a check. It held a promise. Mr. Stevens had left Maya with a future she hadn't expected, and a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. In the weeks that followed Mr. Stevens' departure, the small town felt subtly changed. Though life returned to its usual routines, children going to school, parents heading to work, neighbors sharing pleasantries, there was an underlying current of reflection running through the community. People began to talk about Mr. Stevens differently. The gossip that had once painted him as a dangerous stranger shifted, softened by the truth of his past and the kindness he had shown in the end. The revelation that he had once been a successful businessman, a man who had fallen not through criminality, but through circumstance, left many residents grappling with their own judgments. Some felt guilty for the way they had treated him, for the sideways glances and whispered assumptions. Others still struggled to reconcile their fear with the reality of his situation. But for most, there was a growing understanding that they had failed to see Mr. Stevens as more than the sum of his misfortune. For Maya, the days after his departure were bittersweet. She missed her quiet conversations with him, missed the way he would smile at her when she handed him a sandwich, as if she were doing him a favor much greater than she had ever realized. She hadn't fully understood the impact of her actions at the time, but now it was clear. Her small act of kindness had not only changed Mr. Stevens' life, but had also rippled throughout the entire town. It was in these reflective moments that Maya's mother found herself thinking deeply about everything that had happened. As she watched her daughter sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon, reading the note Mr. Stevens had left her for what must have been the 100th time, she couldn't help but feel a complex mixture of emotions. There was fear, of course. Fear that something could have happened to Maya, that her daughter's innocence and kindness might have put her in harm's way. When the police had first brought Maya home that day, her heart had nearly stopped with panic. But as the days passed and the full story unfolded, her fear gradually gave way to something much stronger: pride. She realized that Maya had seen something in Mr. Stevens that no one else had. Where others had seen danger or suspicion, Maya had seen a person in need, a person who deserved compassion. And in helping him, her daughter had done something far greater than either of them had intended. Maya hadn't just given Mr. Stevens food, she had given him dignity. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Maya's mother turned to her with a soft smile. "You know, Maya," she said gently, "what you did for Mr. Stevens. It was brave, and it was kind. I'm proud of you." Maya looked up, surprised by the emotion in her mother's voice. "But I didn't do anything special, Mama. I just gave him some sandwiches." Her mother smiled, brushing a hand through Maya's curly hair. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most special. You gave him more than sandwiches. You gave him hope when no one else would." Maya thought about that for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I just didn't want him to feel lonely," she said quietly. Her mother's eyes filled with a deep, quiet pride. "And that's what makes you so special. You see people for who they are, not for what they look like or what other people say about them." The town's perception of Mr. Stevens had shifted even further when the news of the scholarship he had arranged for Maya came to light. The letter he had left behind for her was simple but profound. In it, he thanked her for her kindness and explained that he had made arrangements to use his last remaining resources to ensure that she would have the opportunity to go to college. It wasn't a large sum of money, but it was enough to make a real difference in her future. Maya had been stunned when she first read the letter. She had no idea that Mr. Stevens still had any money left, much less enough to set aside for her education. But as she read his words, she understood. He had given her what little he had left because she had given him something far more valuable: human connection. When word of the scholarship spread, the town was once again taken aback. Many residents, especially those who had judged him harshly, were left speechless by this final act of generosity. How could a man who had been living on the streets, a man they had all ignored or feared, leave behind something so meaningful? The revelation forced them to confront their own biases, to question how they had treated not just Mr. Stevens, but others like him who had fallen on hard times. For some, the news was a wake-up call. People who had once walked past Mr. Stevens without a second thought began to reevaluate their own actions. Conversations about homelessness, about compassion, about how the town could do better, started to emerge. Slowly but surely, the walls of prejudice and fear that had existed between the town's more privileged residents and those less fortunate began to crumble. Maya's simple act of kindness had done more than help one man. It had sparked a quiet but significant transformation in the way the community saw itself. It wasn't a dramatic change, and it didn't happen overnight, but people began to look at each other a little differently. The divides that had once seemed so stark, the lines between us and them, started to blur. In the end, it wasn't just Maya who had been changed by her friendship with Mr. Stevens, it was the whole town. But the biggest transformation had happened inside Maya herself. As she read and reread the letter, she realized that the kindness she had shown Mr. Stevens was something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It had taught her a lesson far more valuable than anything she could learn in school: that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves to be seen, to be treated with dignity, and to be helped when they're in need. And as she thought about the future, about the scholarship that would help her achieve her dreams, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had once sat quietly on a park bench, sharing stories with her over sandwiches. He had left her with more than just money for her education. He had left her with the knowledge that small acts of kindness could change lives, including her own. In the end, Maya's story wasn't just about helping one person. It was about how a single gesture of compassion could ripple outward, touching everyone around it, and creating change in ways no one could have predicted. As the sun set over the small town, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Maya sat on her porch, her mother by her side. She thought about everything that had happened, about Mr. Stevens, about the lessons she had learned, and about how much the world could change if more people chose kindness over judgment. And as she sat there, she couldn't help but wonder, would you risk judgment or fear to help someone in need? How far would you go to show kindness? It was a question she hoped others would ask themselves, just as she had. Because if there was one thing she had learned from her friendship with Mr. Stevens, it was that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to change the world.